Hi artists, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be sharing with you a little hack that I know to make sure that your palette doesn't bead up. So do you have a palette that no matter what you do and no matter how much paint you add to your mixing surface, it always beads up and forms into these annoying little pools of water? Well, guess what? There are ways to prevent this from happening, and this video will be all about my tips and hacks to get rid of that annoying little detail. Okay, so let's dive right in. So I have a palette right here that is new-ish. It's actually the palette that I set up for my ultimate palette video, and it has all of my favorite workhorse colors and my exact setup. So if you haven't checked out my video about the ultimate watercolor palette, I'll put a card right here if you're interested in checking it out. So on that subject, I got some messages in the comments about this palette, and also noticed myself that it was beading like crazy. Like right here, if you add a little bit of red to my mixing area, you can see how much it doesn't want to grip my palette and how much the palette is repelling the water. So if your palette is doing the same thing, don't worry because you don't have to throw away your palette. There are ways to fix that, which we will do right now. But first, if you ever were wondering why this actually happens with brand new palettes, and especially with plastic palettes, it's mostly because when manufacturers ship out their palettes to art stores, palettes come with this thin, very waxy coating that helps to protect them in transit. So by the time you get your Amazon package or buy your palette at your local art store, it's in pristine condition without any scratches or any scuffs. However, that coating can prevent your paints from spreading out and gripping your palette properly. So what we're going to do today is remove that coating, and I'll show you an extra step that you can take if you want to optimize your palette even more. So first things first, what do we need? We're going to need a glue stick, a magic eraser, some paper towels, and of course your palette. Since I've already started using my palette, I'm gonna clean out just the mixing area and leave my color wells alone because I already have some paint squeezed on here and I don't want to waste some perfectly good paint. But if you have a brand new or freshly cleaned palette, I recommend doing this to the entire surface of your palette. So I have my palette right here, and like I mentioned, I'm going to clean the mixing surface just because I have a ton of paint already here. So if your palette is already clean, then you can skip this step. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take some wet paper towels and I'm just going to wipe the surface completely clean so that, my paints are not mixing with the glue, which I'm going to apply to this palette once it is clean. All right, so let's get this going and try to clean this as best as I can. As you'll notice, I have a little bit of red staining my palette, but that'll soon go away once I start using my glue stick. So I have my glue stick as well as my magic eraser right here. And we're going to start with the glue stick first and then follow that with this magic eraser. So I'm going to uncap this stick. And I'm going to liberally apply glue onto my palette. And this might sound really strange to you, but don't worry, there's a method to this madness. So I'm applying the glue all over. It doesn't have to be super even or anything. We're going to remove this glue anyway, so don't worry about having to create an even coating. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take a paper towel and start to lather that glue. We want to work it into the surface, which I'm doing right here. And once you're done with that, you can either wash it off, or because I already have paints on my palette, I'm going to try to wipe it all off with a moist paper towel. So that's step one. Step two is we are going to now take our magic eraser and try to remove any residue that was left over from that glue. You can do it in circles, you can do it in straight lines. It doesn't really matter what technique you use here or what kind of arm movement. Just put a little bit of, what do they call it, elbow grease into it. And you'll see that there are sticky bits that don't want to come off, and the magic eraser will help you get all that extra tackiness off your palette. So I've done one side, and now I'm going to do the exact same thing on the other side of my palette, following the exact same technique and instructions. So follow along. All right, so now we are going to do a test to see how it compares to how this palette was beating up before. So I've wet my brush and I'm going to pick up some red on this palette and I'm going to apply it to the mixing area. And you'll see right away that the color is not beating up like it was before. It's staying flat on the surface and spreading out more evenly, so you can see your colors a little bit more clearly when you're mixing them. Let's try this again on the other side of the palette with a blue. The blue is sticking much more evenly, but I can still see a little slight hair of it wanting to beat up. You might have to do this more than once to get all that off, so don't be surprised if, in the first pass it's not sticking the way you want it to. You might have to do it twice and maybe 3 times depending on your palette. Now, if you want to take it a step further and get really excellent grip, or if you have an old palette that needs some sprucing up, I have another trick that I love, and that is to prime your palette. And what you'll need for that is some acrylic gesso. And I get mine from a brand called Golden, and it's worked really well for me, especially on, like I said, older palettes that may be peeling or which are in poor condition. You don't have to throw them out. You can actually revive them with this little trick. So I have my old palette right here, and the idea is that we're going to use the gesso, which is a primer, by the way. So if you ever painted on wood or canvas or a non-porous surface before, you'll know that artists will prime or prep their surfaces with gesso so that the paint can stick to that surface properly. And that's exactly what we're going to do with our palette. We're going to prime it with a couple of layers of gesso. So this palette might look identical to what we just did, but it is an older palette and I have some areas of it that are kind of peeling off, and so I'm going to try to revive it with my acrylic gesso. So let's pop this cap open, and just like before, I think it's really good to have a clean surface before you apply anything, so just make sure you remove as much paint from there as possible. And we're going to get a brush. I would recommend using a cheaper brush, whether it's a brush used for acrylics or even house paint or something like that. And we are just going to apply an even coat of the gesso onto your palette. So you can do this to just the mixing area if you want, or you can also do this to the whole thing, including all of the color wells. So it's really at your discretion what you prefer to do. We're going to try to get this layer to be as even and as flat as possible. So think more of a thin layer that we're gonna repeat a couple of times. We're gonna do a couple of layers of gesso, and the idea here is that keeping it flat will be more beneficial when it comes to mixing your paints on the surface, rather than if you had a gloopier application where you might have some bubbles or some texture going on. So we want to try to avoid any unnecessary texture by keeping our layers thin. While the bottom section of my palette dries, I'm going to go ahead and do the exact same thing on the top, or other side of the palette. So I think it's important to let these layers dry fully before going into it and applying another layer. And I like to do very long brush strokes from one side to the next. I think that in part helps to keep things very even. So that's what I'm going to do, and that's what I recommend. So that looks pretty good, and I'm going to wait for these layers to dry fully before applying my next coat. So let's leave this to dry and come back to it in a couple of minutes, maybe 5-10 minutes, depending on what the humidity level is where you live. I find that 10 minutes is just enough for me. So we're going to repeat this 2 more times. So I do a grand total of 3 layers when I'm doing my gesso application. So rinse and repeat another 2 more times, and it should be good to go. And it looks pretty much brand new once you're done with it. So let's take this on a test run again like we did for the previous technique. And I'm going to pick up some pink, or I guess this is opera pink, just to change things up a little bit. And I'm going to apply it to my now refurbished palette with the gesso layers. And as you can see, it sticks absolutely perfectly. The colors come to life, and your paint will have no problem sticking to the surface because it was primed. And the great thing is, because we used acrylic gesso, it's waterproof, so you can wash it off if you wash your palette after every use. I don't personally do that. I would, however, not recommend soaking your palette in water for an extended period of time because, first of all, I don't think that's a good practice, and it could lead potentially your gesso layer to peel off. So again, I don't recommend that. But if your gesso does happen to peel a little bit, don't worry because you can always add another layer, and the great thing is that you can keep adding layers indefinitely. So like I said, it's a great way to refurbish an old or dying palette and bring it back to life. So there you go. 2 ways of eliminating that annoying beading that you're getting on your watercolor palette. And if you know of any other ways, tips, hacks to optimize your palette, leave them in the comments below because I'm all about finding more efficient and smarter ways to level up your existing art supplies. So feel free to leave that in the comments and also give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. As always, thank you so much for joining me every week, and I'll see you next time.